Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining our webcast today. My name is Jerry Bartels. I'm a civil technical specialist here at Autodesk. Joining me on today's call is Dana Judge and Jeff Bartels. They'll be in the background addressing any questions that might come up regarding what I'm going to cover. So the concept behind this 30-minute workout presentation we've been putting together is to address some of the content that isn't typically covered in a traditional Civil 3D or an AutoCAD session. During those sessions, we need to cover the things that are most important to us getting our jobs done. However, there are so many features and functions within the software that we want to make sure that we set aside some time to maybe exercise some of those features and give you some exposure to some content maybe in a more in-depth or at a level that maybe you haven't seen before. So rather than taking time to figure these things out for yourself, we wanted to create an opportunity to be able to disseminate to you during these sessions. The session's only 30 minutes long. I got a lot of information I want to take and cover. Our objective is that we always start on time, we end on time, because your time is of value to us. So we want to make sure that we start and end and don't run long, and we'll go ahead and get right into it. So the sessions will be recorded. Anybody that's registered for the event, either attended or was not able to attend, will get a link to the recording after it's been completed. In today's agenda, we'll be looking at object snaps. Last week, or the last 2 weeks, the last session, Jeff covered selecting objects. That's probably the one thing that we do most in Civil 3D. The thing that we would probably do second is grab specific points on the screen via object snaps. So during today's session, we're going to focus on that. Many folks would think maybe that'd be just a 5-minute discussion, but trust me, there are enough features regarding object snaps we could actually talk about that for probably half the day. So we're going to talk about things to be aware of when using object snaps. We're going to explore several object snaps we can use when selecting various types of objects. We're going to locate object snaps in space. We're going to perform some mathematical operations on those Osnaps to be able to maybe calculate or derive other locations we'd like to use. And then I want to show you a strategy where we can maybe save some of those settings for future use. And if we have time, we'll get into some bonus content. So because our goal is to be a PowerPoint free zone, I'm going to drop out of this and we'll go right into my Civil 3D and we'll go ahead and get started. So first thing, when we're talking about object snaps, I always like to remind folks that at its base level, always pick on the object that's important, and then the other one is the 51% rule. So if, for example, I was going to draw a line from the endpoint of either of these, the large arc or the line segment, to get object snaps, one of the first things that's my go-to is I hold down the Shift key and then right-click. It's actually an override, but I tend to use that for most of my object snap selections. I'm going to go ahead and select endpoint, and then if I come near the object, you see when we get within a specific distance, it'll grab the endpoint. The important thing to remember about that is as long as you're 51% to one side or the other of a particular object, it will grab that end. I oftentimes see folks like a tractor beam, it lights up and then they feel that they have to click on that. It's absolutely not necessary. So as we move close to that, another thing to remember, if there's a lot of geometry on the screen, maybe it's hard to grab close to where you need. If you get close to an object, if you hit the Tab key, you can actually go back and forth between the object snaps that are currently set. In this case, I'm looking for an end snap, but if I had running object snaps set, it would cycle through all of those as well. All right. So the 51% rule, the other thing, always picking on the object, why that's important, is if I was looking for a center point, for example, we'll go ahead and do the same thing. We'll create a line. I'm going to shift right click. We'll say from the center of the circle. There was a time in the past we would just select on the object, we'd see it light up. Once again, there are folks that try and go in and hit that point in the center. The problem with that is if we drag over other geometry, it may acquire other snaps. So actually trying to pick or locate this could have you lock onto something that you don't necessarily need. So always pick on the object itself. You'll always hit exactly what you need. Don't worry about trying to hit on the actual object snap that is lit up for you. A couple other things is we have a lot of geometry on the screen. If I'm looking for an object snap, if we come in and I'm looking for endpoint, as we get near the object, there is a variable that controls the distance away from the object where that is. That variable is controlled by a tool that's called Aperture. So if I were to take and type that in, the value can be anywhere from 10 to 50. 50 is probably bigger than what we need. In some cases, maybe something lower than 10 might work a little bit better, especially if we have a lot of geometry. I'm going to leave it at 10 for right now. The interesting thing is when we move towards that, sometimes folks, it might be nice to see that box so you know that you're specifically hitting the object you're looking for. We can control that with a variable. It's called AP box, or the aperture box. If we take and turn that on, then if I were to draw a line from, say, anything, use an object snap, we actually see that box, and when that box touches the object, we know exactly what we're getting. All right, so just some other variables that could be helpful. You can tweak the size of that if it helps, and then be able to view it as well. Let's take a look at this. A couple of object snaps that we don't use on a regular basis, like we would maybe end and center in that. Let's turn on some running object snaps here, because I don't want to have to keep grabbing those constantly. My go-tos that I have primarily is endpoint, midpoint, center, node, and intersection. So I'm going to come down. We'll just lock those on for running object snaps for now. And let's take a look at a couple of the other ones. I'm going to say copy. We'll grab this circle. We'll grab it from the center of the circle, and I'd like to drop it in the middle of the square. All right, there's not an object snap there, but by dropping it in the middle of the square, I could actually compute that by using the midpoint between 2 points snap. We could do that by typing in at the command line M2P, or we could right-click and select midpoint between 2 points. Now we just need to give it 2 object snaps, and it'll divide it in half and figure out what that is. So I'll say the end of here, and it automatically drops it at the middle of the square. Now there's another object snap we can use to find the middle or the center of an object. It's GCE, which means the geographical center of the entity. That is something that I will have to type in this case. We'll type in GCE. I'll hit enter, move over towards this object. It's a polyline. It automatically finds that. How complicated can the object be? It can actually be fairly complicated in that if I pick on this, it'll find it even with all of those radiuses in that as well. So as long as it's a closed object, it'll automatically find the geographical center point. Another thing that we can use, intersection. Intersection doesn't physically have to be intersecting lines. Let's go ahead and copy our circle again. Intersection will derive the intersection of those 2 objects extended. So if we were to come down, in this case, we'll say intersection. I'll say it specifically. When we pick on the first one, we'll see the X with the 3 dots. So that acquires the first one, acquires the second one, and it goes ahead and selects that point. So whether it's an arc or a line, we can go ahead and pick on the 2 objects. It'll find the extensions of both of those and then locate it. All right, if I were to try it on this one, we'll go intersection between here and this one. It doesn't find it. And the reason it doesn't find it is if I select these objects and we look at the object viewer, we can see that those objects actually have a vertical separation. All right, but in some cases, maybe it's 2 things that are crossing. I want to grab it from right there, even though they don't physically connect. That would be an opportunity where we would use what's called a parent intersection. So we're going to go ahead and we'll say copy this from the center of here to a parent intersection. Now when we select the objects, one's higher than the other. Whichever one you select first, that's what it's going to use for the Z elevation. So we'll select the lower one, then the higher one. It computes that point. And then if we look at this in space, we'll take and move this up. We can see that it found that apparent intersection and it used the elevation of the lower line. Okay. Now, in some cases, if we're going to grab an object snap, maybe we want to grab an object and use it, the coordinates to help derive that. That's what we use what's called point filters, .x, .y, .z, or easting, northing, and elevation. Let's say, for example, I'd like to copy the circle that's down here. We'll go to a point that's consistent with the northing and easting of this corner and the elevation of this red line. All right, we can do that all with object snaps. We'll go ahead and we'll say copy, select this object from the center point. Once we grab it from the center, we're going to take that we'll use point filters, the northing and easting of an object snap that I'll give it. So we'll say .xy of the end point of here. And then it says at the bottom it needs Z. I'm going to use for my Z elevation the elevation of this line or this point. We'll go ahead and select that. It moves into place. If we look at these objects now in three-dimensional space, we can see that that is at that point, but at an elevation consistent with our red line. Okay? So helpful tools for us if we're actually selecting the objects. In some cases, maybe I don't have objects to select. Instead, I want to find an object in space, maybe relative to another point. In that case, we use a concept that's called direct draw. I'll go ahead and create a line. We'll just pick a point in space here. We'll say I want to go from this direction. As we move the cursor or the crosshair away, I can give it a distance. I'd like to go 10. I'll hit enter. It goes 10 units, 10 feet or so, whatever it's set in the drawing. That direction, 20 in this direction. Okay, that's great, but they're kind of random numbers. If I'd like something specific, we can always come down and hit F8 for ortho. That will lock our crosshairs to be even 90-degree increments. So if I'm making a detail or something like that, I want to go 12 units in this direction, 14 units in this direction, work my way around. We can do that. If my angles need to be something other than just straight 90s, we've got a tool here that we can select for polar. We can select angles of predefined values that have been put in, or we can come into the tracking and we can set additional custom angles that we would like to use. For right now, let's go ahead and do this. We'll come back to the tracking. We'll go ahead and turn that on for just 45s and 90s and make sure that that is turned on. And you'll notice that now it's automatically locking at each one of those angles. So we could come down here and we could go another 12 units. We'll go another 13 units, something like that in that direction. All right, we can keep moving our way around. However, the polar angles are nice, but it's always locking on to a specific angle based off of my coordinate system. In many cases, I'd like that to be relative to the last segment that I drew. And if I come down to here, under the tracking settings, we can tell it that we would like those settings to be relative to the last segment that we drew. So we'll go ahead and select that. And as we start to move, we'll go ahead and look now. It goes 90 in that direction. We can come down. Maybe this is 10. We'll go off in this direction, 90 back that way, or another angle that's going to be 45, another 90 or straight. I can still free pick points. The other thing that I can do is I can also specify bearings with this. We look at the format that it's looking for as we're moving it around. You see it's basically a distance and then an angle. I can give it angles that reference a bearing as well. So I can respond to that with, say, at maybe 30 units. I'll say angle north 22 D for degrees, 22 minutes, 22 seconds east. We'll go ahead and hit enter, and it automatically computes the point from there. And then using the relative tracking from that object, I could track off of that as well. All right, so we can find those points in space using direct draw with finite angles, predetermined angles. We can use relative off the previous objects. We can even throw bearings into the mix as well. All right, let's shift gears again here for a moment. What if I'm going to go to a point and everything we've done so far has been the predicate has been that I know what the bearing is, or I know what the distance is, or to determine that object snap? Can I use some of my existing geometry to figure some of that for me as well? And I can. We can do that with a couple of different tools, parallel and extension being one of them. I'm going to go ahead and create a line. Let's say I'd like to take and create a linear feature of some sort that's parallel to maybe my alignment here. So I'll start drawing off in this direction in space. We'll just pick a point to get started. I want to go parallel to the center line. What I'm going to do is shift and right click. We'll come down to parallel, and I won't select on the object. Instead, I'll just hover over it till I get the icon that shows parallel. And when we move out away from that, it's now locked the crosshairs on that angle. So we'll come out and say I want to go 50 feet. That comes out in that direction. Maybe I want to do something similar with extension. I'd like to go from the end of my alignment, maybe through the intersection and another 40 feet or something that way. But I'd like to extend the alignment out from there. What we'll do is right click. I'll say extension. I'm going to start by hovering over the alignment, move towards the end point. It automatically locks on for extension. I'll come out and tell it I want it to go 40 units. I'll hit enter and it locks onto that point as well. All right, from there we can continue to draw using any of the tools that we've looked at so far. In addition to that, let's maybe take and factor that into maybe another command. I've got a vehicle here on the screen that I'd like to put in the center of the lane. I don't know what the rotation is. I don't necessarily know what the width is, but I can use the object snaps we've looked at so far to derive that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate my object. I'm going to rotate that around the midpoint of the back, and then I'm going to say reference. My reference line will be the midpoint of the back, the midpoint of the front, and I'd like that to match parallel to my street. We'll acquire that, pull in that direction, it locks into that position. From there, we'll go ahead and move it. I'm going to move it from the midpoint back here, and I'd like to match that to a point. We'll say midpoint between 2 points, and my 2 points are going to be nearest. So we'll say nearest to here, and then a point perpendicular to the other side of the lane. So we'll go ahead and select that, and now it's at the right angle and centered on the lane. So didn't know what the lane width was, didn't know what the angle was, but I've positioned it exactly where I wanted it and used the system to compute that for us. In some cases, if I'm going to move geometry, I'm going to move it to another location. I don't want to maybe go to that location specifically, but I'd like to go to that location plus maybe some additional information, like perhaps we'll copy. I'm going to move my circle down here just so it's out of the way. Let's say I'd like to copy this from the endpoint over here, but I'd like it to be not at the endpoint, a distance from the endpoint at a bearing and a distance of maybe 20 feet where I'd like to drop it. So what I'm going to do is we'll copy this guy. We'll say copy it from the center of here, and then I'm going to tell it I'd like it to go to a point measured from the end of here at, we'll say 30 feet, angle north, 22 degrees, 22 minutes, 22 seconds east. So it goes up to there, and then I can go ahead and drop it. Okay, so we don't have to necessarily create construction lines to get the points we need. I could do the same thing. I could start drawing a line, copying a block, rotating something around a point that is from another location. There's another option we can use that's kind of from, but multiple steps. It's something we would use maybe more for details, but that's TK for tracking. Basically, that'll lock the angles to 90-degree segments. So for example, if I was going to show maybe rebar in the middle of that curb, and I've got it blown up, so I'm not going to worry about the distances right now. Let's just go ahead and copy this. Oops. We'll go ahead and copy this guy. We'll copy it from the center of here. I'm going to answer with TK for tracking. We do tracking. I'm going to come and acquire this point, and then I can pull in this direction. I'm going to go ahead and take and turn my object snaps off. We'll pull in this direction, and I'm going to go, I don't know, just whatever that distance is, give it another distance and go up another distance over here. I would know what those are, but like I said, it's at a larger scale, and when I'm done, I'd hit enter. So if I knew it was, 4/10 up and 3/10 over, and it's, like I said, in the detail, something that I can acquire that with 90-degree segments, I can do that and place it exactly where I need to without having to offset lines, determine a crossing, and then put it at that intersection. Okay? Let's take and shift gears a little bit further. Sometimes I want to use object snaps to maybe perform some mathematical operations to determine other object snaps. For example, one we're going to look at here is radius, and the command we're going to use, it's an inline command or transparent command called a calculator. Let's say I want to create a third circle here. I want it to be the same radius as these two. I have no idea what that is. So I'm going to pick my center point for my circle, and when it asks for radius, I'm going to type in the transparent command for calculator, which I could actually perform math. But in this case, the math I'm going to use is a predefined function that's called radius. So I'll use rad. I'll go ahead and touch the circle that I want, and it automatically creates a third one the same size as the other two. I could use the same concept, the radius of the curb here. That's whatever the standard is supposed to be. I really don't know what that is. It doesn't matter. I just need to know that this one matches it. So we're going to say fillet. We'll say radius The radius I'm going to use is apostrophe CAL. Radius for, or rad for radius. Select my arc that we're going to use, and then pick my two objects, and I can go from there. All right, so it's not just single picks. We can also do some math. We looked at geometric center before. I've got 3 points here. Maybe they're borings or something. I'd like to find a point that's in the geometric center of these. Can't use that command for that because it's a point that's in space and I don't have an object. But what I can use is the object snaps to determine that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's copy this guy. I'm going to copy it from, turn my object snaps back on here. We'll say from the center of here, I'm going to say apostrophe CAL for calculator, and then I'm going to put in my expression. The center point plus the center point of the other one plus the center point of the other one divided by 3. And then it's going to ask me to touch the center points. Here's number 1, here's number 2, there's number 3. And it automatically puts it in. All right, I can do the same thing, for example, with this island. I want to take and figure a point that's halfway between here and the end of the island. I don't want the halfway point of this line. It actually, I need to go all the way out to the end. Rather than trying to measure that distance, put it into the offset command, we can do it all through the object snaps. So we'll say offset, specify distance. I'm going to say the distance is going to be from the end of here, but then my second point is going to be apostrophe calculator. We're going to say from the end point plus a point perpendicular to that divided by 2. So it's going to ask to select for endpoint. We'll pick perpendicular. We'll select this object. It's determined that value, and now it's going to ask for object to offset. We'll set it, select it to this side, and I've now got a point that's going to be offset the distance that I need. Once again, using those the geometry that I have to derive the points that I need. All right, let's come back here. There's also some predefined routines we can do with that. I'm going to turn on some layers here. The predefined routines we're going to do is a point along a line at a distance and a point along a line at a percentage of that total line's length. So for example, if I wanted to find a point on this line that was 30 units or whatever, maybe we'll take something that's more generic, 30 units along this line I wanted to place another circle at, we'll go ahead and say that I want to move this. We'll say from the center of here, and I'm going to say apostrophe CAL, and then the expression I'm going to use is PLD for point along a line at a distance. First point I'm going to use is the end point to define it, followed by a comma, nearest, and then followed by my distance. We'll say 30 feet. Close that off. It's going to say select an entity for endpoint. We'll grab this guy, point for nearest to define the line, and there's my point at 30 units down the line. Let's do something similar. I'd maybe like to put something at 75% of the length. I need to put a stripe or something in there that's 75% of the total length. I don't know what the length is. I'm going to have the system figure that out for me. I'm going to say move this from the center of here. We're going to use another formula. We'll say apostrophe calculator. Expression is PLT for point along a line at a percentage. Point 1 is going to be the end point of one end, the end point of the other to determine the length, and then 0.75 for the percentage that I'd like to use. So endpoint 1 is here, endpoint 2 is here, and there's 75% the total length, whatever that length happens to be. All right, so very cool things we can do with that. Some folks might be wondering if there's ways that we can add these to a button. Absolutely there is, and that'll be a topic for a conversation on another day. What I want to take and wrap up with while we still have a few more minutes is looking at saving Osnaps in a script file that we can take and use those again in the future. If we look at our object snaps, these are my go-tos. All right, but if I want to change them, I'd have to go through here, manually change them, and then restoring them would be a challenge. Instead, what I can do is I can store these in what's called a script file. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and just create a new text document here. I'll give this my name for right now. It's just a text file. I'll open that up in Notepad, and I would type in at the command line what I would do for my object snaps. So we'll say OSNAP is the command. Space, we'll say endpoint center, and PER for perpendicular. I'll hit enter. That's what I would have typed at the command line to set those. We'll go ahead and save this. And then what I need to do is I'll give it the extension SCR. So we'll rename this. I'll give this SCR for the extension so that it's a script, something we can play back at the command line. Yes, that's okay. We'll change it. So we see what those values are in here now. If we come back to these that we've saved, because we've saved them, I can just click and drag it and drop it. We look at it here. Here are the ones that I just set. Okay, so very easily I can have something down here on the side. I could have something set up that if I was doing a survey or something like that, I could drag that in. I would automatically get maybe nodes, what the survey folks perhaps be looking for most often. We'll come back and look for maybe something if I'm working with parcels. I could drag that in and drop it, have a different set of settings that I would take and use, and then I can always at any point come back here and go back to my standard, my go-to, the ones I use all the time. It'll restore those and go back to that. Okay, so it can be very helpful. Some folks may be thinking, hey, is there any way I can put that on a button or a tool palette? The short answer to that is yes, absolutely, you can do that as well. The last thing I have here is some bonus information. There are many things that we can do with the shift keys while we're using running object snaps. I've got a number of running object snaps that I have set right now. So if I was to copy this circle from the center of here, as I move out, you can see that it's finding center, endpoint, it's finding midpoint. Well, if I hold down the shift key and hit E, or hold E as well, as I do that, it can only find endpoints now. All right, I don't have to worry about it grabbing anything other than an endpoint. If I hold down the shift key and the C key, now it can only find center points. All right, so I can very quickly filter down the ones that I want to use if it's a particular situation. One of the best ones on here is if I hold down shift and go to S, it requires me to have an object snap. So I'll hold down shift, I'm going to turn off perpendicular here. Hold down shift and go to S. Now it requires an object snap. So whereas before, I could be dropping these anywhere, and if I was close to this and thought I had it and clicked and missed, I didn't get the endpoint. If I hold down shift and S at the same time, if I just try and free pick in space, it just tells me those are all invalid points. I can only drop these at something that's a specific object snap that I've defined. And the last one that we'll take a look at is if I hold F3, if at any point while I'm working it's grabbing object snaps, I can hold down the F3 key and it will negate the object snaps, let me free pick, do whatever I need to do, release F3, and then my object snaps are available again. Okay? Last two things, OS options. I've got hatch here. We don't necessarily want to grab endpoints on hatch, but if I wanted to calculate that angle or do something with it, it might be nice to be able to grab it for whatever reason. There is a tool that allows us to control that is OS options. If I come up to Express Tools, we can look at the system variables and we see OS options. We can set it by default. These bit codes, 1, 2, or 4, it ignores things that folks generally don't want to be troubled with. So by default, it's the addition of these three is 7. If I'd like it to object snap on hatch, for whatever reason, I would set that to OS options. And we would set that to, right now it's 7. I'm going to set it to 6, so 1 less than that would turn that on. Now if we were to take and draw a line, I could come into here and I've got object snaps on any of these things within my hatch. All right, last and final thing, I showed you how to make a script file. You specify the different values that you want. All of your values are for your settings are set up in a value that's called Osnap mode. Much the same way we looked at before. Any object snap that you have, we'll say OS mode, it's got a bit code associated with it. The addition of all of those numbers together represents all the ones that are turned on. So it's a unique value, whatever it is. So rather than, you could set the ones you want, go into OS mode. It would tell you what that number is. Oops. it would tell you what that number is, and then we could use that, just 47, reset that, and it would set it back to all the snaps that you need. Okay? So with that, I'll run back here to Jeff and Dana and check, were there any questions or anything that came across that need to circle back on?
As far as I know, they've all been answered, and if not, we will try and if there are additional questions, we can answer them as well.
Yep. Okay. If there's anything came in, please reach out to Jeff, Dana, or myself. We'd be happy to address any questions of what we've covered today and help you out. So thank you again for your time and attention. Look forward to seeing you again at another event. See ya.